In this video, we will show you how to replace your power steering rack assembly on the Chevy Silverado. This will be located under your vehicle. Let's get into it. A quick note, when performing this service, you need to flush out the power steering fluid before you continue on. Make sure you flush it out with the manufacturer's specified fluid. You make your way right down to the reservoir here, pop that cap, and flush it out as needed. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. Once you have flushed the power steering system and you're sure you have new fluid in there, let's continue on to removing as much of that fluid as possible from inside of the power steering fluid reservoir. Let's get the cap back on here temporarily. The first thing we need to do is make sure that we tie off the steering wheel so there's no way that this can turn on you while you continue under the hood. This can easily be done with a small rubber strap. You can take that strap and bring it around the steering wheel all the way down to the grab handle under the seat. Let's move down from that reservoir and we'll be looking for our steering shaft where it connects onto the power steering rack. All the way down in this area, you're going to find that you have an 11mm pinch bolt that goes through from this area all the way through to the other side of the shaft. We'll go ahead and remove this bolt and then remove the shaft from the power steering rack. You may have to pry it up. If that's the case, you might need to make your way underneath the vehicle to do so. Now that I got it started, I'll just continue on with my air ratchet here. A quick inspection of that bolt. It's typically a good idea to go ahead and replace it. Otherwise, you definitely want to at least clean it down and inspect it. With the pinch bolt out of there, let's pay attention in this area right here. We'll just use a small pry bar and give this a couple taps. We want to try separating the two ears, just enough that we can slide this up and off of the shaft that comes out of the power steering rack. Hit this with some penetrant. Careful not to damage the steering shaft while doing so. Now that we have our bar in here, let's take hold of this. We should be able to give it a slight wiggle. Once it is broken free, you can remove the bar from this portion. Let's continue up the shaft a little bit with a 15mm. You're going to find another pinch bolt. We'll loosen this bolt and remove it. Now the next thing we'll do is continue on with a small hammer. We're going to cause some light vibration to attempt to try to break this free from the power steering rack below. Go ahead and give this a quick inspection. If it feels like this joint right here is binding, you have to replace the steering shaft. This one feels fine. We'll set this aside. The next thing you'll have to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so both of your front wheels are off the ground. We're going to be removing them. To remove each of your wheels, remove the center cover by using a 22mm. A quick inspection of that and set it aside. Behind that, you're going to find that you have 6 22mm lug nuts. Remove each of those and then the wheel. Now that we have this side off, do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. Now that we have both wheels off, the next thing we need to do on each side of the vehicle is come over to the jam nut in between the inner tie rod end and the outer tie rod end. Use a 21mm to break this free by turning it clockwise. Once you have movement from there, we'll continue on to our outer tie rod end mounting nut. To remove the mounting nut from this area, you're going to find that you have one locking cotter pin. Remove your locking cotter pin and dispose of it properly. With that out of the way, we'll continue on with an 18mm. Remove the mounting nut, give it a quick inspection, and start it on there just a couple threads. The next thing we'll need to do is separate the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle. You could use a separator of some sort or just use a hammer. A couple loving bonks should cause some vibration. A quick inspection of that tie rod end, we want to confirm we did not damage it. Continue on by turning this counterclockwise, counting the amount of turns it takes to fully remove it. 1, 2, and so on. My count was 23, yours may differ. Go ahead and write that down somewhere. Go over and do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle and write that number down as well. Now let's make our way under the vehicle. We're going to look for where the lines connect to the power steering rack. Go ahead and clean down that area. With this area cleaned, we'll continue on to removing our return line from the power steering rack fitting. Now we can continue on to carefully grabbing onto this clamp. We'll squeeze it a little bit, and then we'll slide the hose out of place. There could be some fluid that comes out of this area. Make sure you have a collection bucket handy. Some long nose pliers for this if you have some. Slide this off of there. Go ahead and give that hose a quick inspection and we'll set that aside for now. We'll use an 18mm to remove the fitting from the power steering rack. A quick inspection and we can set that aside for now. Let's do the same thing to the other line. You're using an 18mm for this once again. Let's give that line a quick inspection. We'll set this aside as well. Moving along from those lines, if you were to look just below them on the power steering rack, you're going to find a ground wire. Use a 10mm to remove the mounting bolt. A quick inspection of that bolt will set it aside. Remove the wire from the area, give that an inspection as well. I don't see any corrosion. Looks pretty good. Now we can start removing the power steering rack. You're going to find that it's held in place with a 24mm headed mounting bolt that comes through from the front towards the rear, and the rear is held in place with a 24mm mounting nut. Go ahead and hold the nut with the wrench and loosen the bolt from the front. There we are. Remove the nut and the washer from along the back side. Do the same on the other side of the rack over there. Carefully take hold of your power steering rack and remove it from the vehicle. And slide those bolts through if you need to. There it is, friend. Before we install our brand new rack, there's a couple things we have to do. First, let's start at each one of our mounting points. We want to clean and inspect them to make sure it's not rotted and damaged in any way. Also, go ahead and take hold of that bolt, slide it through, and inspect the threaded area. If it looks like it's rotted or damaged in any way, you need to go ahead and replace these bolts, and when you do them as a pair. Both of these look fine. Let's make our way to the front of the frame. Along the front of the frame, let's continue on to removing the ground strap. The new rack doesn't require this. Use a 13mm on the mounting bolt. Go ahead and set that aside for recycling. Okay friend, it's time to prepare the brand new power steering rack for installation. Before you put this in the vehicle, it's important to make sure that you center it. What I mean by that is if you were to look at one end of the power steering rack where the inner tie rod end is, you might happen to find that it sticks out further than the other side. We want to make sure that it's centered. To do this, we're going to make our way up to the upper shaft area here. Let's remove the protective cover. At this point, you could remove this protective cover as well, but typically I like to leave it on here so I can hold onto it with some locking pliers and not cause any damage. Now that I have that in place, the next thing that we need to do is turn this all the way to one direction slowly. When doing so, you want to make sure you have these two plugs in the open position, not necessarily off, but at least a little loose. When you turn this, you might happen to find that pressure comes out of one port or the other. Be extremely careful. Just make sure these are loose, like I said. Now that we've gone all the way to one side, we're going to make our way all the way to the other side. While turning this, we're going to count the amount of turns, divide that in half, and then we'll continue on by turning it back to the centered position. We're pretty much at the end there. Nice and slow. 1, 2, approximately 3. Go ahead and divide that in half. You've got approximately 1.5 turns. 1, approximately a half right there. We'll make any other needed adjustments once we get this in the vehicle. Okay, let's get ready to install our brand new power steering rack. Let's be careful not to make this off center while we bring this into position. Bring this up into position, slide our mounting bolts through. Get our washers on there, and of course our mounting nuts. Now, once you have this started on, the next thing that you need to do is bottom this out and then torque each one of these mounting bolts and nuts to 136 foot-pounds. With the rack in place, let's continue on with our lines. We'll be starting at the top here. For the top, this is where the return line will go to. We'll make sure that we have our return line adapter. You'll notice that I cleaned up the threaded area, and it's also a good idea to replace that O-ring gasket down at the far end where it goes into the power steering rack. Go ahead and start this in by hand and snug it up. We'll be using our 18mm for this. Okay, right there is bottomed out. Just give it a tiny bit extra. Of course, you want to double check to make sure it is completely secured. We do not want to have a power steering leak in any way. Continue on to that power steering return hose. For this, we'll be squeezing the clamp, slide the hose and clamp into position, and then of course make sure it's nice and tight. We've got our return hose here. When you go to slide this in position, you do not need to bring it all the way down to the fitting portion. You will find halfway up the shafted area that it does have a small bubble. That's essentially where you need to get up to. We'll make sure that we can see hose on both sides of that clamp. Give the hose a little tug to make sure it's completely secured. Continue on to your power steering pressure line area. We'll remove this plastic cover, take that power steering pressure line, make sure we have a brand new gasket, and install that by hand. Once you're done with the lines, go ahead and clean up the area. Perfect. Now while we're in this area, let's pay attention to the bottom portion of our steering shaft where it will go onto the power steering rack. Typically, you're going to find that there is some rust in this area. Let's go ahead and clean it out with some solvent and a bore brush. We'll use some anti-seize in that port. Okay, let's pause here and make our way to our tie rod ends. For the next process, you're going to be doing the exact same thing on each side of the vehicle. We'll take that jam nut and just bring it in approximately 3/4 of the way down the threads. Coat this area with some anti-seize. We'll continue on with our outer tie rod end. For your outer tie rod end, we're going to install this the same amount of turns as it took to remove it. 1, 2, and so on. Here we are. I had 23 on my application. Yours may differ. Continue on with that mounting nut. We'll bottom this out. We'll torque this to 48 foot-pounds. Once you have that torqued, the next thing you need to do is pay attention to the slots on the mounting nut in comparison to the hole that goes through the stud of your tie rod. We need it to align so you can put in a cotter pin. If it's not, continue tightening until the very next slot is. Slide through the cotter pin and pin it over so there's no way it can loosen up on you while you drive down the road. Now it's time to pay attention to that jam nut. We'll turn that counterclockwise until it bottoms out against your outer tie rod end. Hold on to the outer tie rod end and continue tightening this with your 22mm so it's completely tightened against the outer tie rod end. Level out your tie rod end so it's parallel with the ground. At this point, you know exactly what to do. Go over to the other side of the vehicle and do the exact same thing. Once you've completed that, it's time to reinstall the wheels on both sides of the vehicle. Go ahead and take the wheel and put it in position. Start on all 6 of your 22mm lug nuts and bottom them out. We'll get the wheel safely back down on the ground and then we can torque these to 140 foot-pounds. We've got the other side back together and the wheels back on the ground. We'll torque these lug nuts in a crisscross manner to 140 foot-pounds. Torqued. If your vehicle has center covers, go ahead and install those now. You'll find that they have plastic covers. Each one of those covers screws onto your lug nuts. Perfect. We'll go over and do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle, and then we'll meet you in the engine compartment. In the engine compartment, we'll be looking for that steering shaft. Go ahead and take that and put it in place onto the power steering rack. Make sure you align the pinch bolt hole. At this point, you may need to twist the steering shaft a tiny bit one direction or the other. Be extremely careful if you do remove the strap from the steering wheel not to let it completely spin. Let's wiggle this on here. Now as we slide it down, you want to make sure you're holding onto the upper shaft and start sliding this down onto the power steering rack. Now we can start with our center mounting bolt here. We do have that mounting nut. For the nut, it just essentially goes along the back side there. Slide the bolt right on through. Start this on by hand. Once you have it started in, you can bottom this out and then torque it to 35 foot-pounds. Let's torque this to 35 foot-pounds. Make your way all the way down to that bottom portion where it connects to the power steering rack. We'll be using our pinch bolts. You can use some blue thread locker if necessary. Just go ahead and slide that right in there, start it in, snug it up, torque that to 37 foot-pounds. The next thing you'll want to do is remove the strap from around the steering wheel, and we'll make our way back out here to fill up our power steering system. Now it's time to fill the power steering system. Let's make our way to that power steering reservoir. We'll remove the cap. At this point, we're going to go ahead and fill up the power steering reservoir with the manufacturer's specified fluid. When I say fill it, I don't mean all the way up to the top. We only want to come approximately 3/4 of the way up the reservoir. After that, we're going to pause out here and make our way into the passenger compartment. Now that we have this topped off up to here, let's carefully raise the front end of the vehicle so both front wheels are off the ground. After that, make your way into the passenger compartment. In the passenger compartment, we're going to have the key in the on position and turn the wheel all the way to one side, and then continue turning the steering wheel all the way to the other side. Repeat this process. What we're doing is we're looking inside that reservoir and we're watching for air bubbles making their way out of the system. Once you've confirmed you have no more air coming out of the system, make your way back out here and we're going to top off the fluid. This time it's important to pay attention to the power steering reservoir cap. As you can tell, I'm a little low here. We'll continue adding. Let's check it. Okay, let's go ahead and start it up. Now that we've topped off the fluid, the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and start up the vehicle, let it get up to normal operating temperature. While it's getting up to temperature, go ahead and check for fluid leaks. After it's at normal operating temperature, you're going to make your way back over here and triple check that fluid just to make sure it's topped off. After that, you can go ahead and close the hood, take your vehicle for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.